Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Greece had a faithful friend in poverty. It's a strange thing to say about a land that was considered glorious, proud, undefeatable, elegant, and cultured. Yet, that's how things were. Many Greeks earned their livelihood through trade, others with fine crafts. But the dry, stony, barren, and infertile Greek soil produced very little. From the 8th century BC, the Greeks started emigrating, mostly to the west, toward Italy and Sicily, a very fertile land, and in an ideal position for trade, since it was in the middle of the Mediterranean sea lanes. While excavating on Sicily, archaeologists realized that around the middle of the 4th century BC, many cities expanded into new quarters, often far from the coast. They found numerous buildings in the interior of the countryside. What was the cause of this population explosion and shift in locations? By consulting ancient historical texts, especially those written by Plutarch, scholars came across a very important event. In 339 BC, the Greek colonies on Sicily defeated the Phoenician colonies in the west in a memorable war at Himera. They thereby laid the foundations of their supremacy on the island and beseeched their homeland for strong men to thoroughly colonize Sicily. One of the puzzles that has long been debated among archaeologists is the nature of the first Greek colonies on Sicily. Were the first settlers, the pioneers who came to Sicily, peaceful explorers who lived in harmony with the local inhabitants, the so-called Sicanians, or did they forcefully take control of the best land on the island? According to the accounts of ancient historians, the Greeks were belligerent people, unlike the Phoenicians who also settled on the island, although only for trade purposes. Greek settlers were described as being intent on owning arable land. While the Phoenicians built emporiums along the coast and were not interested in the interior, the Greeks tended to expand and take military control over vast areas. Ortygia is a small island adjacent to Sicily, and the first settlement of what would become the largest Sicilian colony of ancient times, Syracuse. Excavations under the present-day cathedral there, which incorporated the Greek temple of Athena, led to the discovery of an ancient indigenous colony that was supplanted in the 8th century BC by a Greek colony. Archaeologists were able to pinpoint the date after studying the type of pottery they found. Studies revealed that Greek settlers had driven out the native Sicanian peoples, conquered the city of Syracuse, and expanded beyond Ortygia into the mainland. The building boom the Greeks initiated may be found to this day in the still existing quarries that the Greeks later used to lock up prisoners of war. But people weren't constantly at war on Sicily. There were long, peaceful periods during which Greek settlers exchanged products and compared their artwork with Phoenician settlers and the Sicanians, thereby keeping the island humming with prolific cultural exchange. Syracuse, in the 4th century BC, was an enormous city with mighty fortresses and numerous monuments that were elegantly decorated. Among the most famous pieces is a Gorgon mask and the Venus Landolina. Across the canal on the mainland was the second part of the city, a city that had become the largest and most important in Sicily. Excavating here, in what is presumed to be the more recent quarters of the city, archaeologists came across a theater. Strange inscriptions engraved in stone appeared at various points. Translators soon realized that all those graffiti had something in common. They were names of gods and famous kings. But what was the relationship between them? Systematic excavation of the theater and reliefs revealed a strange symmetry between the points in which the inscriptions were found, which led them to unravel the mystery. The names had been engraved to distinguish the theater's various sections and seating arrangements. It was here that the premiere of one of the most representative dramas of Greek culture, The Persians by Aeschylus, was held. The play is about the great victory of the Greek city-states, united for once, over the militarily strong Persians, whom the Greeks defined as barbaric and lacking culture. The premiere at Syracuse meant that Sicily had become, over time, an integral part of Greece. After all, Aeschylus, like Archimedes, was a Siciliot, a Sicilian Greek, and spent most of his life at this theater. The theater symbolized the presence of Greeks on Sicily. The Phoenicians were primarily devoted to trade and spent little time on literature. And the Romans, who arrived later, preferred the oval-shaped amphitheater, where they could watch gladiators in action. Perhaps the world's highest concentration of ancient Greek theaters is on Sicily, where culture was associated with wealth. This one, at Tindari, opens toward the sky and gives us a sense of how the Greeks attempted to create dramatic visual impact to intensify the pathos of their tragedies. One of the most spectacular Greek theaters on Sicily is undoubtedly the one at Taormina, dug into a promontory overhanging the sea. This one at Catania, at the foot of Mount Etna on the east coast of Sicily, is like a gem perfectly inserted into the city landscape. On the other side of the island was Agrigento, and along the way was a noted latifundium, a great landed estate with a magnificent home, almost a palace, and a rest stop, a so-called Filosofiana Statio. This place for centuries existed only in the pages of an antique guidebook called the Itinerarium Antonini, but eventually it started revealing traces of itself. In the 50s, archaeologists systematically began excavating the ruins 40 miles from Catania in the vicinity of Piazza Armerina. They came across a real treasure, the Villa del Casale, an owner's country house containing the largest, richest, and most complex set of late antiquity mosaics that have stood the test of time. Nearby, at a place called Sofiana, similar treasures were discovered, preserved over the centuries. Archaeologists unearthed some bricks there, stamped with a seal with the word philosophe impressed on it. By joining both words, we get Filosofiana, the ancient and wealthy landed estate described in the Itinerarium Antonini. This luxury and this concentration of mosaics, along with the Villa del Casale itself, was typical of the Romans, however, and not the Greeks. The Romans arrived on Sicily after the Greeks, So these finds actually date from the late antiquity period of the 4th century AD. Philosophiana, the estate's name, perhaps originated from the owner's interest in philosophy. Or he could have been an aristocrat involved in the circus business or gladiator contests. Perhaps he was a great merchant who traded in exotic animals. One of the largest and most famous mosaics found here is the so-called Great Hunt. The mosaic runs along a corridor measuring an amazing 216 by 16 feet. The same shapes appear in the xystus, the covered floor of the gymnasium. This other mosaic, found not far away, which modern scholars have called girls in bikinis, has led us to believe that a gymnastic competition was held in the corridor of the Great Hunt. Reaching Agrigento at the other end of the island, we find a valley studded with temples, many of which are miraculously still standing. This one, the Temple of Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, was rebuilt with original material. Imagine, dozens of temples in a single valley. This great archaeological legacy was not the result of a discovery. It has always been there. Such a concentration of majestic public works has left scholars truly perplexed and not a little mystified. Archaeologists realize that the most important temples, like this one called the Temple of Concordia, or this imposing one, the Temple of Zeus Olympus, decorated with telemones, gigantic figures used as pillars over 23 feet high, were erected only a few years apart, around the middle of the 5th century BC. Who could have handled such a huge workload in such a short time? And where did all the money come from? Scholars looked for the answer in ancient books by Greek historians Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus. They speak about a tyrant from Agrigento called Theron, who a few years earlier had won a devastating war against the Phoenicians. The victory brought him riches. It also brought him an incredibly large number of slaves, so much so that some inhabitants of Agrigento owned over 500 of them. The slaves were obviously a great help in building a valley full of temples. This is what the Temple of Concordia would have looked like with its original colors in the 4th century BC. In fact, it was incorrectly believed that all Greek temples were white. The Temple of Concordia is a typical temple of the classical period, with 6 columns on the short sides and 13 on the long sides, surmounted by clean-shaped Doric capitals. Its base, made up of 4 steps, was designed to overcome the rises and drops in the rocky terrain. The poet Pindar said that Agrigento was the most beautiful city of mortals, and certainly the temples were its Doric glories. In a tranquil setting not far away, at Selinunte, also known as Selinus, one can find 3 temples in a row erected on level ground. They are ancient and majestic, and identified simply by letters of the alphabet, E, F, and G. Very little is known about them. The ruins of the most imposing one, Temple G, have given archaeologists a real mystery to unravel. The columns, ruined at the base, are partly smooth and partly fluted. Although the different styles were both used by the Greeks, in no temple were both styles used together. Archaeologists wondered about the reason for this mixture. It was certainly not for aesthetic reasons, since classical Greek art was based on stylistic consistency. They compared the design with building techniques used in those times. We know that columns were assembled in blocks, the so-called drums, one on top of the other, until they reached the capital, and only then fluted. Therefore, the column of Temple G may have been unfinished. But why was it never finished? Scholars found the answer in some diplomatic treaties between the Greeks and Phoenicians. Although Selinunte remained a Greek city, it came under Phoenician influence around 409 BC. That date marked a watershed in its history. In order to conquer Selinunte, the Phoenicians attacked it with overwhelming force and destroyed many of its monuments. Most likely, Temple G, still needing its final touches, was destroyed at that time. When the temples were standing in their full glory, however, they were a grand sight. Temple G was perfectly aligned with Temple E. The sacred complex that included a third temple called Temple F was erected on the city's eastern hill. Temple G was the largest of the three and measured 370 feet on the long sides and 177 feet on the short sides. Although this temple was built in the distant past, in the 6th century BC, it was one of the most regal of the Greek world and soared to nearly 100 feet in height. The size of Temple G, the city's pride, can be inferred by its columns, which themselves are almost 56 feet high. Their abacus, the square part of the capital that rests on the architrave, extended for an amazing 172 square feet. The majestic Temple G demonstrates the importance of the city of Selinunte, founded as a colony of another city called Megara Hyblia. However, Selinunte was developed more because of its two seaports. The wealth of the city encouraged a certain degree of sophistication in its architecture. This temple is truly one of a kind. You realize it when you enter the nave. The space inside, the heart of the temple, is strangely uncovered. Archaeologists wondered whether this temple had some function other than religious. Its grand size and importance seemed to suggest it. After studying an inscription found there, they figured out that it may have contained the treasury of Selinunte, like the main temples of other Sicilian cities. The central nave was arranged on two levels. The upper level, accessed by two side staircases, was not open to worshippers. Besides aesthetics, it had a more practical function. It was used for the routine upkeep of this high structure, particularly the colossal wooden trusses that supported the roof. The temple's cella housed the statue of the god, probably Apollo or perhaps Zeus. Among the ruins, archaeologists discovered only a headless bust, so the discussion remains open. The Acropolis, the highest part of the city, was where the well-preserved Temple C was located. The new Phoenician quarters were built in the vicinity of the Acropolis after Selinunte had come under their control. But the Greeks had decided to stay. And the Elemi, an indigenous population from nearby Segesta, later frequented the city. They often fought with the inhabitants of Selinunte, but at times also collaborated with them. In this connection, Greek historian Thucydides recalls the signing of a treaty between the two peoples that allowed them to intermarry. Thus, more than in any other place on Sicily, on this Acropolis, one could perceive that mixture of races and variety of backgrounds that make a culture great. Sicily. Its trade, riches, and elegant buildings made it the beating heart of Magna Graecia. Sicily, bridging continents and civilizations. A fertile and colorful land where long after Homer's time, the Greeks still believed the cattle of the sun gods roamed the hills. Sicily, a land coveted by many, yet ultimately controlled only by beneficent nature. Sicily, the jewel of the exotic ancient Mediterranean. The first millennium BC was the era of Greek colonization of the Mediterranean. It expanded in two main directions, to the west in the direction of Sicily and the Magna Graecia, and to the east into the Aegean Islands, and onward to the coasts of Ionia. The Oriental Greek colonies, both those on islands such as Delos, Kos, and Rhodes, now part of modern Greece, and the ones along the Ionian coast, such as Priene and Miletus in modern-day Turkey, were favorably positioned crossroads for both mercantile and cultural exchange. This was an area where the coastal Mediterranean civilizations, the Carthaginians, the Egyptians, and the Greeks, often met and traded with the peoples of the Far East, the Persians, and the Indians. The caravans traveling by land from the Orient to trade their goods needed ships to continue their trip across the sea toward the west. The Ionian coastal cities and other towns on the nearby islands became quite prosperous, both in economic and cultural terms. It was a favorable area for the blossoming of art and science, and was the homeland of distinguished persons in all branches of knowledge, including poets, orators, and philosophers with a great thirst for culture. Public speaking by these renowned men was commonplace. In Priene, one of the most fascinating cities of ancient Ionia, archaeologists unearthed a strange tiered building with a square floor plan. They immediately realized that it must have been used for town meetings and was thus either a bouleuterion, the meeting place of the city senate, or else an ecclesiasterion, a place where the people held their assemblies. Excavations also revealed this beautiful theater with a capacity of nearly 5,000. The square building, on the other hand, only sat 640. Evaluating these two constructions in the light of the area of the excavated city, and by studying historical sources regarding the size and number of inhabitants of Priene, researchers concluded that the people assembled in the open-air theater, while the Senate met in the smaller roofed bouleuterion. Here's what the Senate chamber would have looked like in ancient times. This was the pulpit, reserved for orators and their public speeches. The Greek philosophers from the Hellenistic period were divided into several different schools. The most illustrious of them, the Epicurean school, sought to spread its doctrine among the local senators. The Epicureans believed that by adhering to a model of proper life and an ideal of wisdom, a person could achieve happiness. The concept was intriguing to the Priene senators, since there was still much warfare in the world at that time. The Epicureans had a sense of pride in their land, since they believed Ionia was the birthplace of philosophy. Its forefathers came from the school of Ionian scholars many centuries earlier. Thales, Anaximenes, and Anaximander, the first cartographer to create a map of the entire world, and the first man, predating Darwin by over 2 millennia, to intuit the concept of evolution, claiming that humans had evolved from fish. As the city of Priene was gradually dug up, archaeologists realized that it was a city like no other. Everywhere they dug, they found stairway after stairway. There were stairs at every change in elevation. Why? Did the townsfolk prefer this solution to sloping roads? Or did they not know how to build them? Or was there another reason? When researchers recreated a map of the city with its original streets and buildings, they made a surprising discovery. They found that the city was laid out on a perfectly orthogonal road grid. In addition, all the east-west streets were level, while those running north-south had steps to lead to the various levels of the city. This must have been an intentional design. But who could have conceived it, and why? The answer lay in philosophy. Ancient sources record that it was one of the most illustrious Ionian philosophers, Hippodamus of Miletus, who founded the science of urban planning. Instead of letting a city grow in a haphazard fashion, Hippodamus felt it should first be drawn out rationally on a map, preferably laid out on an orthogonal grid, with precise functions assigned to each neighborhood. Hippodamus went on to design cities throughout the Greek Empire. Not far from Priene on the Ionian coast was the city where Hippodamus was born. In the late 1800s, researchers unearthed a fantastic city with grand colonnaded avenues, enormous baths, and sumptuous buildings. They immediately thought it might be the powerful city of Miletus, which changed hands several times between the Persians and the Greeks. Everything seemed to support this hypothesis, except the fact that Miletus was a coastal city, while this site was a good 6 miles from the sea. Archaeologists remained in doubt until they unearthed this construction, decorated with beautiful lions. With its piers and moorings, it could only have been a harbor. Not far off, they discovered another harbor, christened the Theater Harbor, because it was overlooked by this beautiful and immense theater, which had a seating capacity of 15,000, one of the largest in all the Greek Orient. Although the sea was not there when archaeologists discovered the city, it must have been there before. The explanation for the mystery was later offered by the Meander River, which forms a broad delta near the ruins. Over the centuries, the river deposited enormous quantities of sediments and pushed the coastline much further out from where it had been during the first millennium BC. In the process, it buried most of the city and left another large section immersed in swampy land. Excavations later confirmed that the archaeologists had indeed found Miletus. When they drew a map of the various buildings, they realized that here too, as in Priene, the city had been laid out according to the urban planning philosophy of the city's most illustrious son, Hippodamus of Miletus. In addition to the perpendicular streets, what is striking here is the concept of functionalism developed by the great urban planner. Each zone had a specific building type. The two harbors, the Lion Harbor and the Theater Harbor, were linked by an upside-down L-shaped zone where all the civil, commercial, and religious buildings were found. At the edges of this zone were the ordinary residential areas. The true philosopher has to refuse all that is irrational, avoid strong passions and chaos, and dedicate himself unswervingly to rational thought. The Epicureans believed as well that human bodies were products of the earth, just like stones and plants. There was nothing immortal about the human soul. Therefore, people should forget their fears of gods and punishment in the afterlife and live for today, conferring value only on things that could help them during their lifetime. Hippodamus' urban planning scheme was certainly in this category. On Delos, a small but important island in the eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists uncovered a series of terraces with buildings dedicated to the worship of various divinities. Inscriptions and statues led to surprising discoveries. All the sanctuaries in this area paid homage to foreign gods: Serapis, Isis, Anubis, venerated by the Egyptians, as well as the Sabiri, worshipped in this Samothracion, a sanctuary built to the gods of Samothrace. Why was there such a large presence of non-Greek gods on this Greek isle? Scholars consulted various ancient texts and discovered, with the help of the historian and geographer Strabo, that Delos was home to the ancient world's largest slave market. Merchants and slave dealers arrived from all parts of the world to buy and sell the most important economic resource of those times: manual labor. Delos thus became kind of a crossroads in the Mediterranean and went out of its way to offer its visitors a vast area for worship, later named by archaeologists the Terrace of Strangers. As an influential visitor on Delos, you might be invited to be a guest in the homes of well-to-do Greeks. Delos was truly a cosmopolitan place, a place where everyone could feel at home without having to boast of any superior fatherland, a place where diversity meant richness. The winds of affluence filled the sails of Delos, the legendary home of Apollo. It was truly a treasure island of the Aegean. Not far from Delos, another island, Kos, was mentioned by Strabo as being extremely rich and ornamented. Its main city was not large, but according to the Roman historian, it was the most beautiful of all, known for its architecture and later for the marvelous mosaics that excavations revealed. Archaeologists, with the help of mythology, tried to give names to the figures portrayed. This is Zeus, disguised as a bull, kidnapping Europa. Here, Eros is depicted as a fisherman. And here is the judgment of Paris. But who is this person arriving on Kos by boat? And who is that waiting for him? The answer came from these ruins. We are in one of the many sanctuaries of the ancient world dedicated to Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. This is a building that was used to care for the sick. But the Kos sanctuary has a special distinction. As stated in literary sources, it was built after the death of the greatest doctor of the ancient world, Hippocrates, who held lessons on Kos in the shade of a plane tree. Hippocrates was the first to write a scientific treatise on medicine, freeing this art from its association with magic and grounding it firmly in experience and the observation of nature. The mosaic thus represents a passing of the torch from the god Asclepius arriving on Kos to Hippocrates, who awaits him on shore. The large sanctuary was built by exponents of Hippocratic thought. It was both a place for treatment of the sick and also a medical and philosophical school, an enormous monument to medical progress. One of the great themes at this time in the pursuit of happiness and wisdom was the achievement of victory over pain. Hippocrates had founded a bona fide school of medicine on Kos, which his disciples carried forward for centuries, a school which was located right under this portico. Here, philosophers would gather with the great masters of medical art, with whom they could debate the concept of pain. On the second terrace is where the priests were located. They were part of the sanctuary dedicated to religious rites in honor of the god Asclepius. These rites persisted in spite of the fact that Hippocrates had made a science of medicine, complete with a text that encompassed all medical knowledge, the Hippocratic collection, and with a deontological code, the Hippocratic Oath, still sworn to by doctors today, that established rules of behavior for those practicing the noble art of medicine. Even though religious symbols were strong at the sanctuary, with the prominent temple of Asclepius standing out on the third and highest terrace, Hippocrates was still recognized as the greatest doctor of all time. He took medicine out of the hands of priests, understanding that all diseases had natural causes, never mystical ones. He knew they could be traced back to the climate and condition of the body in the immediate environment. He also thought the type of government could affect illness as well. He went so far as to promote democracy over tyranny on the basis of its beneficial effects on health. Among these colonnades, the main treatment area where the sick were bedded and healed, philosophers would have ready examples to support their theory, how the absence of pain contributes to peace of mind and hence to happiness. In cases where recovery was delayed or did not arrive at all, there was a philosophy available that could sustain you. If a man succeeded in detaching himself from his passions and attaining inner peace, which the Epicureans called ataraxia, physical pain would be tolerable. Violent pain could be handled because it did not last, while chronic pain could eventually be ignored. In 1936, an Italian archaeologist, Luciano Laurenzi, digging on the island of Rhodes along the walls of the city of the same name, made a sensational discovery. He unearthed, one by one, a series of heavy stone spheres. There were hundreds of them in all sizes. The smallest weighed 4 pounds, and the largest, almost 600. What would so many heavy balls have been used for? It was soon clear that Laurenzi had discovered a large arsenal. The stone balls were projectiles for catapults, used before the days of cannons. But the quantity of ammunition must have been related to some exceptional event in the history of Rhodes. Historical records supported this thesis. In 305 BC, a great military leader, Demetrius Poliorcetes, had attacked the wealthy city of Rhodes. Rhodes had the largest grain market in the entire Mediterranean and was a flourishing banking center. It thus comes as no surprise that it attracted the covetous gaze of conquerors and military leaders. Though Demetrius had overcome many other cities and had brought powerful war machines with him for this battle, he was defeated by the people of Rhodes. As a testament to their invincibility, and perhaps also as a warning to those approaching the island with bellicose intent, the Rhodians built the largest statue ever seen, the 100-foot-tall bronze Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Archaeologists wondered what techniques the Rhodians had used to forge and erect such a formidable giant statue. The most plausible hypothesis is that the Rhodian sculptors did not cast the statue as a single piece, which was impossible, but superimposed multiple layers of bronze at different times. Probably as the statue slowly grew bigger, sculptors realized that the higher the statue got, the bigger the body parts had to be on top, so that the beholder on the ground could have the proper perspective. The Colossus was thus made relatively lightweight at the base and significantly heavier toward the top. Unfortunately, in all probability, this was the factor that resulted in its sudden collapse. Soon after its construction, an earthquake toppled the great Colossus of Rhodes. A few centuries later, it was sold for scrap to be melted down. The Colossus of Rhodes was therefore an experiment, a completely innovative project from which designers drew important lessons for further achievements in art and engineering. The Ionian Greeks named the land they had settled Anatolia, from the Greek for rising sun. And indeed, the glistening images and art they left behind, the illuminating philosophical thought, the architectural advances, the medical heritage, worked indeed like a rising beacon of enlightenment. Yes, the mercantile aspects of the land brought money, but it was wisely put to use in developing knowledge and wisdom at the service of mankind, an approach that could only find a homeland in the most open and cosmopolitan part of Greece, the far eastern sector, washed by the sea and in contact with distant lands. Here the mind was given free rein, nurtured and admired so it could flourish, allowed to expand in bursts of creation, and thus fulfill its voluminous potential. A taste for the ancient, a desire to learn about the history of our predecessors, has always enlivened people's minds. The ancient Greeks and Romans also loved to study their forefathers. Their attention was focused on the cultures and cities of the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC. Among the ancient civilizations of interest to Greek and Roman historians were the Egyptians along the Nile, the Assyrians and Babylonians on the Tigris and Euphrates, and the pre-Hellenic societies of Greece, the Minoans on the island of Crete, and the Mycenaeans in the Peloponnesus, who inherited their power. The mystery and allure of Egypt was always a strong attraction. The age of the pharaohs had long faded by the 2nd century BC, but the traces of that glorious past were still to be found everywhere. Inscriptions carved into the columns of temples told of grand deeds. Historians were fascinated with the story of the great Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III, inscribed into the columns of the temple at Karnak. Thutmose had organized a great military campaign to conquer the Near East in the 15th century BC. When Thutmose reached those lands, however, he found that many of the very ancient Babylonian cities on the Tigris and the Euphrates had already been reduced to majestic ruins steeped in history. Of those ghost cities, one in particular has had an irresistible allure for historians: Ebla. Ebla was a legendary Assyrian city north of the Euphrates and the capital of an important ancient kingdom. But the ensuing centuries buried the ruins in sand, erasing all traces of the settlement from human memory. Apart from the inscription at Karnak, all that had remained of Ebla was a citation in the Bible. One day, some farmers were out plowing their fields when they came across a magnificent bas-relief. The news attracted an Italian archaeological team who unearthed pottery, elaborate utensils, and the torso of a statue bearing a votive inscription that clearly specified the name of the city. Ebla had been restored to existence. But the most sensational discovery came in 1975, when the Italian team unearthed 17,000 tablets bearing cuneiform text dating back to 2300 BC. Once translated, they were discovered to be commercial treaties and administrative and legal documents. Paradoxically, that immense treasure was preserved through the millennia thanks to a violent act of destruction. Around 2300 BC, the city was attacked and razed to the ground by King Sargon of Akkad. The tablets had been stored neatly on shelves in the archives of the royal palace. The palace collapsed in such a way that the tablets were left stacked one atop another, a position which favored their preservation and allowed archaeologists to accurately reconstruct their content. Ebla was a flourishing commercial center in ancient Syria, and its king was a rich merchant. Commerce was so important to the king that caravans leaving for the Orient or for the Mediterranean were invited to lodge in the royal palace. These caravans were the genesis of the city's fortunes and kept its king in power. If they were headed west, the caravans would make their way to the sea. From there, ships would carry cargo to western lands and pick up trade goods for the return journey. Some of the goods that traded hands included fine pottery and art, but also much-needed metals for weapons and armor. Sailing the Mediterranean at that time, however, was a great risk. Whoever had the biggest ship controlled the seas. And for a long time, it was a population known for acts of piracy who dominated the Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans. Between Mycenaean Greece and the Orient, there was a city that preyed on ships traveling along the Hellespont toward the Black Sea, the legendary Troy. The Mycenaeans fought a war against this city that has captured the imagination of historians and generations of students. Troy, once known as Ilios or Ilion, was a flourishing Hellenistic city. It was also one of the greatest mysteries challenging archaeologists. Many dedicated long years of their lives searching for it, lured by the fabulous treasures it promised. But it was not easy to rouse the beautiful Helen, the brave Hector, or King Priam from their slumber. Troy, the city whose siege was described so eloquently in perhaps the world's most famous book, Homer's Iliad, could have been anywhere. In 1868, a dilettante German archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, decided to invest the money he had earned in the import-export business to pursue his lifelong dream, to discover the places where the heroes of his youth, the heroes of the Iliad, had fought. The Iliad was certainly not a scientific treatise. Before being committed to writing around the 5th century BC, it had been handed down through generations by way of oral tradition and referred to events that had happened hundreds of years earlier. Yet Schliemann decided to put his faith in the text. Many archaeologists were hunting for Troy, and they looked for it on this hill, known as Bunarbashi, in an area between the Turkish cities of Çanakkale and Izin. Schliemann, however, was not convinced by that location. He combed the Iliad in search of clues. Homer mentioned two rivers, the Scamander and the Simoentia. The battles among the Homeric heroes took place around a fortified citadel built on a natural rise. They may have been figments of the author's imagination, but Schliemann chose to believe them. This hill, Hisarlik, was quite similar to the Homeric description. It was here where Schliemann began digging, and in the end, it was here where he found Troy. Nine different cities, one built upon the ruins of another, emerged from the excavations. From the second layer, Schliemann discovered amazing treasures, cups and vases, weapons, golden jewelry and buttons. He thought he had found the treasure of Priam. We now know that these jewels did not belong to the Trojan king of the Iliad. Modern archaeology, a science based on rigorous analytical methods far removed from the intuition that guided Schliemann, has dated the objects to several centuries before the Battle of Troy, attributing them to a royal family from the 3rd millennium BC. But for the German archaeologist, the findings were none other than the treasure of Priam. His belief was supported by the evidence of fire in the layer where he found it. And Homer had said that Troy was burned to the ground by the Mycenaeans, who entered the city after a 10-year siege thanks to the stratagem of the Trojan horse, which now stands in replica on the site. Schliemann thought that the Troy attacked by the Mycenaeans was the same fortified city he had excavated, laid out in this plan dating back to the 3rd millennium BC. A city surrounded by walls barely 400 feet in diameter would hardly have stood up to 10 years of siege, nor been able to house Priam's court. According to recent studies by teams at the universities of Tübingen and Cincinnati, in the 2nd millennium BC, the era of the Mycenaeans' conflict, Troy was encircled by these much more extensive defensive walls, and probably grew even more toward the end of the 1st millennium BC. Relying on descriptions in the Iliad and taking into account recent archaeological discoveries that have uncovered new portions of the ancient city, we can now relive the legendary Mycenaean siege of Homer's Troy. This is what the Mycenaean soldiers would have seen when they landed in force from the sea to challenge the city. The sight of menacing warships headed for Troy was probably not unusual for King Priam and his people. The 9 layers that were found at this archaeological site correspond to 9 different cities, bearing testimony to the cycles of destruction and rebuilding. We now know that Troy, in addition to being of strategic importance for control of seafaring traffic, was also the foremost producer in its time of finished and semi-finished objects in gold. And so it is no surprise that it attracted the attentions of nearby populations. Conquering Troy meant not only eliminating the taxes it imposed on merchant traffic toward the Black Sea and the Orient, but also the reward of a rich booty. And so it was essentially economic motives that drove the Mycenaeans into Homer's legendary war, while Homer's account of the beautiful Helen and the courage of heroes like Achilles and Hector has richly imbued the event with drama and romanticism. Troy was an extremely wealthy city and appropriately defended, surrounded by massive walls extolled by Homer as being invincible. That's why, after 10 long years of a fruitless siege, the Mycenaeans were forced to come up with the expedient of the wooden horse. Troy was destroyed and rebuilt 9 times, the last time during the Roman epoch. One of the grandest city plans was created by none other than Alexander the Great. The noble deeds of the Trojans against the Mycenaeans were so vivid in the young leader's mind that he made an offering of his armor to the goddess Athena, who was venerated in Troy. In response, the Trojans presented Alexander with armor that they claimed was used during Homer's war. The historians Strabo and Plutarch both reported the anecdote that Alexander the Great always wore that armor into battle, considering it to be a sacred symbol. In the 1800s, it was believed that this fortified city was of medieval origin, so archaeologists never bothered to dig within its walls in search of evidence of ancient civilizations. However, the nature of the location and the massiveness of the walls attracted Schliemann's attention. He had crossed through this area on the Peloponnesus on the search for Troy, and was quite struck by these enormous stacked masses located near modern-day Argos. His mind was flooded with the images of the myths of his childhood and the words of Homer, who made mention of only one Mycenaean city girded by walls, the legendary Tiryns, built by the giant Cyclops. Schliemann, inclined to live out the dreams of his youth and to take seriously the contents of ancient books, refused to accept the idea that that gigantic fortress dated back only to the Middle Ages. Those rocks inspired in him legends and myths hailing from the dawn of time. And there was also the Greek historian Pausanias, who confirmed the Homeric accounts about the existence of Tiryns. Pausanias had even gone so far as to compare the grandeur of the fortifications of Tiryns to the pyramids of Egypt. So somewhere near Argos, there still had to be those Cyclopean walls. Such a grandiose monument could not have simply vanished into thin air. And once again, the excavations vindicated Schliemann. At the top of the citadel, the ruins of a marvelous palace were found, with frescoes in Minoan style dating back to the 2nd millennium BC. It was the fortress of Tiryns. And once again, a destructive war was the reason for the preservation of all that beauty. The upper floors of the palace, collapsing onto those below, had filled the frescoed rooms with debris. The fire set by the invaders then melted the bricks, creating a sort of shell that preserved the remains of the palace. But who were the powerful invaders able to destroy such a powerful city protected by these imposing walls? Historians discovered that the winners of this epic victory were the Dorians, a people from the north who settled in Greece after driving out the Mycenaeans. The secret of their power? Their weapons were made of iron, a material unknown to the Mycenaeans, who fought with more brittle bronze weapons. The strength and audacity of Achilles' heirs availed them little. Their swords shattered as soon as they touched those of their enemies. One Mycenaean city stood out above all others, the city that gave its name to the great conquerors of Troy. It was called Mycenae, a city recorded by Homer as having an abundance of gold. Its monumental gate, overlooked by 2 lions, still inspires awe. This was the realm of the great king, the leader of the legendary expedition that destroyed Troy, Agamemnon. The intrigue surrounding a legendary locale has always been a strong stimulus to archaeologists. Where was the tomb of Agamemnon? Had he ever really existed? Had Mycenae's golden riches, recorded by Homer, been spared the ravages of time? Pausanias, in his writings, said that Agamemnon's tomb lay within the walls of Mycenae. But the city was surrounded by two sets of walls, an external one that protected the dwellings, and an internal one to protect the royal citadel. The search carried out within the external walls proved vain until Schliemann arrived on the scene. The archaeologist sunk his shovel near the Lion Gate, inside the royal citadel. And he dug until the ground had yielded, from a number of tombs, the glittering metal immortalized by Homer, 33 pounds of gold. Among the treasures was a series of marvelous golden funerary masks. This was a privilege certainly reserved for kings. And in the features of the most beautiful mask of all, Schliemann claimed to recognize Agamemnon, the great king and military leader. Archaeologists have since discovered that those treasures date back to a period prior to Agamemnon. The excitement of that find was so great, however, that no one has since dared to rename this one-of-a-kind piece. The finely chiseled golden mask is still known to all as the Mask of Agamemnon. Schliemann had reached the heart of the Mycenaean civilization, the legendary home of its great king. And of course, a great king needs a great palace. Entering these rooms, recreated here according to Homer's description, we can see what a profound influence the Mycenaean culture had on the Greeks. The Mycenaean civilization handed down its own image to posterity, partially through architecture. This room with the hearth in the center, called a megaron, the heart of the palace, became the model for the most typical of the Greek buildings, the temple. The king's house thus became the house of the gods. Mycenae was a city of which legends were made, as was Tiryns and the incomparable Troy. The legends and the mythic heroes that accompanied them would have remained only that, pure fiction, if not for modern-day heroes like Heinrich Schliemann, men who follow their passions, pursuing a knowledge of humanity that enriches us all. We lay bare the paths of civilizations of heroes that came before, for a better understanding of the possible hero who sleeps within us all.